In war-torn St. Malo, a mysterious dog appears at Father Thomas's church, bringing hope to a desperate congregation. As bombs fall and tensions rise, the animal's uncanny abilities save lives and soften hearts. But when a young resistance fighter vanishes and a German colonel grows suspicious, the dog's presence becomes both a miracle and a threat. Will this unexpected messenger of faith survive to unite a divided town? The old stone church stood resolute amidst the war-torn city of St. Malo, its walls scarred by shrapnel but its spirit unbroken. Father Thomas sighed as he gazed upon the dwindling congregation, their faces etched with worry and fatigue. The war had taken its toll on everyone, and even here, in this sanctuary, the weight of conflict hung heavy in the air. As he began the morning mass, the priest's weathered voice echoed through the nave, a comforting constant in these uncertain times. Halfway through the service, a collective murmur rippled through the pews. Father Thomas paused, his eyes searching for the source of the disturbance. There, padding quietly down the center aisle, was a dog. Its coat was a patchwork of brown and white, matted in places but clean enough to suggest it wasn't entirely a stray. The animal moved with purpose, head held high, as if it belonged there among the faithful. For a moment, Father Thomas was at a loss. In his 30 years of priesthood, he'd never encountered such an unusual parishioner. He watched as the dog settled itself in an empty spot near the front, its intelligent eyes fixed upon him with an intensity that was almost unnerving. The priest cleared his throat, ready to ask someone to remove the animal, but something made him hesitate. There was a dignified air about the creature, a sense of reverence that seemed oddly fitting in this holy place. Deciding that there were far greater concerns in a world at war than a dog at mass, Father Thomas resumed the service. He couldn't help but notice, however, how the tension in the room had eased. Smiles tugged at the corners of mouths that had forgotten how to do so, and a few children giggled softly at their peculiar visitor. As he spoke of hope and perseverance, Father Thomas realized that perhaps this unexpected guest had brought a small miracle of its own, a moment of joy in dark times. Life in St. Malo had changed dramatically since the occupation began. The once bustling port city now operated under a cloud of fear and suspicion. Curfews were strictly enforced, food was rationed, and the constant presence of enemy soldiers served as a grim reminder of their lost freedom. Yet, amidst the hardship, the resilient spirit of the Malwines endured. They found ways to resist, small acts of defiance that kept hope alive. And for many, the old stone church remained a beacon of solace in troubled times. Among the regulars at Father Thomas's daily mass was Maria Dupont, an elderly widow whose son had been taken as a forced laborer. Her weathered hands clutched a worn rosary as she prayed fervently each day for his safe return. Beside her often sat Colonel Steiner, a German officer who attended out of a mix of genuine faith and a desire to monitor the congregation. His presence was a source of tension, a reminder of the oppressive regime that had overtaken their lives. The day after the dog's first appearance, Father Thomas found himself distracted as he prepared for Mass. He wondered if the animal would return, and what it might mean if it did. As the parishioners filed in, a mix of curiosity and anticipation filled the air. Maria took her usual seat, offering a warm smile to the priest. Colonel Stein arrived moments later, his uniform crisp and imposing as he surveyed the church with watchful eyes. Just as Father Thomas was about to begin, a familiar form appeared at the entrance. The dog had returned, its tail wagging slightly as it made its way down the aisle. This time, there were no murmurs of surprise, but rather a collective held breath as the congregation watched to see what would happen. Father Thomas felt a strange sense of relief as the animal settled into the same spot as before. For reasons he couldn't quite explain, the dog's presence felt right, as if it were meant to be there among them. The air raid sirens wailed their mournful warning, shattering the pre-dawn stillness. Across St. Malo, people scrambled from their beds, hearts pounding with familiar dread. Father Thomas hurried to open the church doors, knowing that many would seek shelter within its sturdy walls. As the distant rumble of bombers grew louder, a stream of frightened citizens poured into the nave. The priest moved among them, offering words of comfort and guiding them to the safest areas. Amidst the chaos, a group of children huddled together, separated from their parents in the panic. Tears streamed down their faces as the first explosion shook the ground. Father Thomas was about to go to them when a blur of movement caught his eye. It was the dog, appearing as if from nowhere, its eyes alert and purposeful. To the priest's amazement, the animal began to herd the children, gently nudging them towards a small side chapel where several adults were already taking cover. The bombing intensified. The whistle of falling ordnance, followed by thunderous impacts that rattled the church's very foundations. Father Thomas watched in awe as the dog worked tirelessly, somehow managing to locate disoriented individuals and guide them to safety. It moved with an almost preternatural sense of where the next bomb would fall, steering people clear of areas just moments before debris came crashing down. As suddenly as it had begun, the raid was over. An eerie silence fell over the church, broken only by muffled sobs and whispered prayers of thanksgiving. Father Thomas stood at the altar, surveying the scene with a mixture of relief and wonder. The dog sat quietly nearby, its duty seemingly done. In that moment, looking at the animal's calm demeanor amidst the shaken survivors, the priest felt a profound shift in his perception. This was no ordinary dog, he realized. Somehow, in the midst of man's cruelest acts, this creature had demonstrated the very essence of compassion and courage. In the days that followed the bombing, life in St. Malo settled into an uneasy rhythm. The damage from the raid was slowly repaired, but the psychological scars ran deeper. Father Thomas noticed a surge in attendance at daily mass, as people sought solace in faith and community. And without fail, every morning, the dog would appear at the church door, patiently waiting to be let in. The priest found himself looking forward to the animal's arrival, a small constant in a world of uncertainty. The congregation, too, had come to expect the dog's presence. Children would smile and point as it made its way to its usual spot near the front. Even some of the adults would reach out to pat its head as it passed, drawing comfort from its steady demeanor. Father Thomas observed how the atmosphere in the church had changed. There was a lightness, a sense of hope that hadn't been there before. He couldn't help but attribute some of this change to their unusual parishioner. As the days turned into weeks, Father Thomas began to wonder about the dog's life outside the church. Where did it go when Mass was over? Did it have a home, a family who cared for it? He considered following the animal one day, but hesitated, feeling as if that would somehow break an unspoken trust. Instead, he contented himself with the dog's daily visits, grateful for the small miracle it seemed to represent in these troubled times. One morning, as he prepared the altar for Mass, Father Thomas found himself talking to the dog. "You know," he said softly, "I've been a priest for 3 decades, and I've never seen anything quite like you." The animal cocked its head, as if listening intently. "I wonder what you're trying to teach us," the priest mused. As if in response, the dog let out a soft whine and placed its paw gently on Father Thomas's foot. The priest smiled, feeling a connection he couldn't quite explain. Maria Dupont had always been fond of animals, but in the years since losing her son to the labor camps, she had avoided forming attachments. The pain of separation was too raw, too fresh. Yet, something about the church dog touched her heart. Perhaps it was the way it sat so attentively during Mass, or how it seemed to sense when someone needed comfort. Whatever the reason, Maria found herself looking forward to seeing the dog each day. One morning, after Mass had ended and most of the congregation had filed out, Maria approached the dog with a small piece of bread she'd saved from her meager rations. "Here, little one," she coaxed gently. The dog accepted the offering with surprising delicacy, its tail wagging in gratitude. From that day on, it became their ritual. Maria would bring a small treat, and the dog would sit with her for a few moments after Mass. Father Thomas observed this budding friendship with interest. He noticed how Maria's demeanor had changed. There was a spark in her eyes that had been missing for too long. One day, after the church had emptied, Maria approached him. "Father," she said, her voice warm with affection, "have you noticed how this dog seems to know just who needs a little extra attention each day?" The priest nodded, encouraging her to continue. "It's as if it can sense our pain, our fears, and somehow its presence makes those burdens a little lighter." The priest considered Maria's words carefully. He had indeed noticed the dog's uncanny ability to provide comfort where it was most needed. "Perhaps," Father Thomas replied thoughtfully, "this is God's way of reminding us that hope and love can come in the most unexpected forms." Maria smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "Yes, Father. I believe you're right. This little creature, it's given me something I thought I'd lost forever. It's given me hope." Colonel Steiner had always prided himself on his vigilance. As an occupying officer, it was his duty to be aware of any potential threats or acts of resistance. The regular appearance of the dog at the church had not escaped his notice, and with each passing day, his suspicions grew. Why did this animal come so faithfully? Was it merely a stray seeking shelter, or was there something more sinister at play? One Sunday, after a particularly moving sermon on compassion, Colonel Steiner approached Father Thomas. His face was a mask of stern authority, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Father," he began, his accent clipping the words, "I must speak with you about this dog." The priest tensed, sensing the potential for conflict. "Of course, Colonel. What concerns you?" Steiner's eyes darted around the emptying church before settling back on the priest. "It is highly unusual for an animal to behave in this manner," he stated. "I fear it may be trained, perhaps carrying messages for the resistance." Father Thomas fought to keep his expression neutral, though inwardly he marveled at the absurdity of the accusation. "Colonel," he replied calmly, "I assure you, this dog is nothing more than a loyal creature seeking sanctuary. Much like the rest of us in these trying times." The German officer's jaw clenched, clearly unsatisfied with this explanation. "Nevertheless," he insisted, "I must demand that you prevent this animal from entering the church. It poses a potential security risk that I cannot ignore." Father Thomas felt a surge of protectiveness, not just for the dog, but for what it had come to represent to his congregation. "With all due respect, Colonel," he said firmly, "this church is a house of God, open to all his creatures. I will not turn away any sole human or animal seeking solace within these walls." The tension between Father Thomas and Colonel Steiner simmered in the days following their confrontation. The dog continued to attend Mass, much to the colonel's visible frustration. However, a new worry soon overshadowed this conflict. Young Pierre, a local boy known for his involvement with the resistance, had gone missing. The 14-year-old scout often carried messages between resistance cells, a dangerous task that filled his parents with constant dread. Word of Pierre's disappearance spread quickly through whispered conversations and worried glances. His parents came to Father Thomas, their eyes red-rimmed from sleepless nights. "Please, Father," Pierre's mother pleaded, "pray for our boy's safe return." The priest offered what comfort he could, his heart heavy with the knowledge of the dangers the young scout faced. That evening, as he led the congregation in prayer for Pierre, Father Thomas noticed the dog sitting unusually still, its ears pricked as if listening intently. The next morning, as Father Thomas prepared for Mass, he was struck by an unusual silence. The familiar scratch of paws at the church door was absent. As the congregation filed in, murmurs of concern rippled through the pews. Where was the dog? Even Colonel Steiner, entering with his usual military precision, cast a puzzled glance at the empty spot near the altar. Father Thomas felt a strange unease settle over him as he began the service. Halfway through the Mass, a commotion at the back of the church caught everyone's attention. The dog had arrived, but instead of taking its usual place, it paced restlessly, whining softly. Father Thomas faltered in his reading, watching as the animal moved to the door, looked back at him imploringly, then returned to its agitated pacing. In that moment, the priest felt a certainty he couldn't explain. Something was wrong, and somehow, the dog knew what it was. As soon as the Mass ended, Father Thomas hurried to the back of the church. The dog was waiting, its tail wagging with nervous energy. "What is it, boy?" the priest murmured, reaching out to pat the animal's head. In response, the dog moved to the door, looking back expectantly. Father Thomas hesitated only a moment before making his decision. "Lead the way," he said softly, grabbing his coat and following the dog out into the war-torn streets of St. Malo. The journey that followed was like nothing Father Thomas had ever experienced. The dog moved with purpose, leading him through narrow alleys and past crumbling buildings. They skirted checkpoints, the priest's heart pounding as they ducked into shadows to avoid patrolling soldiers. At one point, the distant crack of gunfire sent them scrambling for cover. Through it all, the dog remained focused, pausing only to ensure its human companion was keeping up. As they ventured deeper into the city's outskirts, Father Thomas began to recognize the signs of recent bomb damage. Entire blocks had been reduced to rubble, the acrid smell of smoke still hanging in the air. The dog picked its way carefully through the debris, occasionally stopping to sniff the air before changing direction. The priest marveled at the animal's determination, even as his own fear grew. What were they heading towards? And why did he feel so certain it had something to do with young Pierre? Suddenly, the dog froze, its ears perked forward. A faint sound carried on the wind. A cry for help, barely audible but unmistakably human. Father Thomas felt his heart leap into his throat. The dog looked back at him, as if seeking confirmation, then darted forward with renewed urgency. The priest followed, scrambling over fallen beams and around piles of broken masonry. As they rounded a corner, he saw it, a partially collapsed building, and trapped beneath a fallen door, a small figure in a scout's uniform. "Pierre?" Father Thomas called out, rushing to the boy's side. The young scout looked up, his face pale with pain and fear, but alive with relief at the sight of the priest. "Father Thomas," he gasped, "how did you find me?" The priest knelt beside him, quickly assessing the situation. "It wasn't me, my boy," he said softly, nodding towards the dog who stood vigilantly nearby. "Our four-legged friend here led the way. Pia's eyes widened in recognition, a faint smile crossing his lips despite his predicament. As Father Thomas worked to free Pia from the debris, the boy explained what had happened. He had been on a mission for the resistance when the bombing started. Caught in the open, he'd sought shelter in the building, only to have it partially collapse around him. "I've been trapped here for 2 days," Pia said, his voice weak. I thought no one would ever find me." The priest's heart ached at the fear in the boy's voice, even as he marveled at the dog's inexplicable ability to locate him. With a final heave, Father Thomas managed to lift the door enough for Pia to wriggle free. As he helped the boy to his feet, the ominous drone of aircraft filled the air. The dog began to bark urgently, tugging at the priest's cassock. "We need to move," Father Thomas said, supporting Pia as they began to make their way back through the rubble. The dog led the way, choosing a path that seemed to weave between danger zones with uncanny precision. They had barely made it a block when the first bombs began to fall. The world around them erupted into chaos, the ground shaking with each impact. Father Thomas pulled Pia close, shielding the boy with his body as debris rained down around them. Through the dust and smoke, he could see the dog waiting just ahead, barking encouragingly. With a silent prayer, the priest gathered his strength and pressed on, following their loyal guide through the storm of destruction towards safety and hope. The news of Pia's miraculous rescue spread through Saint-Malo like wildfire. For many, it was a beacon of hope in the darkness of war. However, for Colonel Steiner, it was a source of deep suspicion. The morning after Pia's return, the German officer stormed into the church, his face a mask of barely contained fury. "Father Thomas," he barked, "I demand an explanation. How did you know where to find the boy?" Father Thomas met the colonel's gaze steadily, aware of the delicate situation he faced. "Colonel," he began carefully, "I simply followed the dog. It seemed distressed and led me to Pia." Steiner's eyes narrowed dangerously. "That dog," he spat, "is clearly more than it appears. I believe it's being used by the resistance. As such, I'm requisitioning it for military use. We'll soon discover what secrets it may be carrying." The priest felt a chill run down his spine at the colonel's words. He knew what military use could entail, and the thought of the loyal animal being subjected to such treatment was unbearable. "Colonel, please," he pleaded. "The dog is innocent. It's brought nothing but comfort to our congregation. Surely you can see that." But Steiner was unmoved. "My decision is final," he declared. "The dog will be taken into custody immediately." As word of the colonel's demand spread, the church filled with concerned parishioners. Maria Dupont approached Father Thomas, her eyes brimming with tears. "We can't let them take the dog," she whispered urgently. "It's become a symbol of hope for all of us." The priest nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders. He knew he had to find a way to protect the dog, but doing so could put him at odds with the occupying forces. It was a test of faith unlike any he had faced before. Sunday Mass arrived, and the church was packed to capacity. Everyone had heard about Colonel Steiner's demands, and there was a palpable tension in the air. Father Thomas stood at the pulpit, his heart racing as he surveyed the congregation. In the front row, Colonel Steiner sat rigidly, his cold eyes fixed on the priest. And there, in its usual spot, sat the dog, seemingly oblivious to the controversy surrounding it. Taking a deep breath, Father Thomas began his sermon. "Today," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word, "I want to talk about faith. Not just faith in God, but faith in each other, in the goodness that resides in all of creation. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the anxious faces before him. In these dark times, we've been blessed with a reminder of that goodness, in the form of a humble creature who has touched all our lives. As Father Thomas spoke, he recounted the dog's unwavering devotion, its comfort to the grieving, and its bravery in the face of danger. He described how this animal, with no agenda or allegiance except to kindness, had brought light to their darkest hours. In this dog, he continued, his voice thick with emotion, we see a reflection of the divine love that binds us all. Can we, in good conscience, repay such selfless loyalty with cruelty and suspicion? The church was silent as Father Thomas concluded his sermon. I ask you all to search your hearts, he said, looking directly at Colonel Steiner. In a world torn apart by war, can we not find room for compassion? Can we not recognize the miracle of love and loyalty when it appears before us, even in unexpected forms? As he stepped down from the pulpit, Father Thomas saw tears in many eyes. And even Colonel Steiner seemed moved, his stern facade cracking ever so slightly. In the days following Father Thomas's impassioned sermon, a change came over St. Malo. The dog, which had been a source of comfort for so many, now became a symbol of resistance against the cruelties of war. Parishioners took turns watching over it, ensuring it was never alone or vulnerable to capture. Even those who had initially been skeptical of its presence now fiercely defended its right to attend Mass. Colonel Steiner, to everyone's surprise, did not immediately follow through on his threat to seize the dog. Instead, he seemed to be engaged in an internal struggle, often observed watching the animal with a mixture of suspicion and grudging admiration. One evening, as Father Thomas was closing up the church, he found the colonel waiting for him, his usual authoritative demeanor notably subdued. Father, Steiner began hesitantly, I may have been hasty in my judgment. The priest listened patiently as Steiner spoke of his own childhood dog, a loyal companion lost in the early days of the war. I had forgotten, the colonel admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, how much comfort an animal can bring in times of darkness. Father. Thomas felt a surge of hope as he recognized the change in the man before him. It's never too late to remember our shared humanity, he said gently, placing a hand on Steiner's shoulder. From that day forward, an unspoken truce settled over San Malo. The dog continued its daily visits to the church, no longer under threat. Colonel Steiner, while still bound by his duty, showed a newfound leniency towards the townspeople. And Father Thomas, watching over his flock both human and canine, felt a renewed faith in the power of compassion to bridge even the widest divides. In the midst of war, they had found an unexpected path to peace, guided by the unwavering loyalty of a simple dog.